Hello everyone, and welcome back to Real History. I am your host, History Professor Jared Frederick. About a year ago, we did an in-depth analysis of Steven Spielberg's 1998 war epic, Saving Private Ryan. This is arguably the most in-depth historical breakdown of the film available on YouTube. And almost literally, we went scene by scene, dissecting and separating fact from fiction. Our episode, available in its entirety in the link below, was almost as long as the movie itself. And it is a treasure trove of historical evidence, commentary, photographs, and so much more. And of course, we welcome you to go and check that out. In honor of the D-Day anniversary, though, we have done a special edit of our original episode. We have condensed and, in a way, remastered our original footage, and we're presenting you a shorter, more digestible breakdown of the movie's most iconic scenes. And of course, that is some of the opening shots, which looks at the attack on Omaha Beach on June 6th, 1944. This is heralded as one of the most accurate depictions of warfare brought to the big screen, and it certainly captures the incredibly gruesome nature of that battle. But how accurate is it in the long run? Where did the producers and the filmmakers take artistic liberty? Where did they condense things? Where did they take some shortcuts? What did they do right? What did they do wrong? If you're curious about these questions, hopefully they will be answered in this episode of Real History. So let's not waste any further time. Let's descend down into the Higgins boats and head right towards Omaha Beach. Despite what the opening caption here says about Dog Green Sector, Charlie Company of the 2nd Ranger Battalion actually landed in Charlie Sector of Omaha Beach. And Captain James Miller, Tom Hanks' character, is not a real-life individual. The real-life captain of Charlie Company was a 24-year-old officer by the name of Ralph Goranson. And he had absolutely, no delusions as to just how tough a job that his mission was going to be. His battalion commander, James Earl Rudder, said to him that you're going to have the toughest goddamn job of the invasion on your hands. And indeed he did. In contrast to Tom Hanks, who was around 41 years of age as this movie was being filmed, Goranson was 24 years of age, and unlike Hanks's character, he actually lived to the year 2012. And so if you want to have a kind of an authentic image in mind, picture Tom Hanks circa 1980, and you probably have a better approximation of what Ralph Goranson may have looked like. As we're introduced to Captain Miller here, we can see, of course, captain's bars on his helmet. And the idea of whether or not an officer landing on Omaha Beach with the 2nd Ranger Battalion would actually designate his rank, because if your rank is easily identifiable, you're going to be a better target for a German opponent. But this was kind of decided at a company level. There were, some officers in some companies who decided to cover up their markings. There were others, though, who thought that being easily identifiable as an officer was an important facet of their leadership once the men reached the beachhead. And so obviously we see here that Captain Miller has opted to go that leadership route. Seasickness was quite prevalent for troops who were hitting the shore. And this not only had to do with the immensely choppy waves and of course the nervousness and tenseness of the situation, But as a lot of these men had gotten up hours before the crack of dawn, and the mess galleys and the cooks and whatnot on the various naval vessels that they were on wanted to give these guys a good rich meal, because they realized that for a lot of them it would be their last meal, and they wanted to feed them well. And so a lot of these GIs who were hitting the beaches, they were getting served eggs, sausage, bacon, really, really greasy stuff. And when all of that is sloshing around in your stomach with 5-foot waves, it creates a little bit of, shall we say, consternation in your gut. And hence why a lot of men were vomiting as they were hitting the shores.
Clear the rim! 30 seconds! Got me with you!
As we see the U.S. sailor here as well, this is one of the inaccuracies at the outset of the film, because the men of the 2nd Ranger Battalion were actually taken ashore by British sailors, members of the Royal Navy. Believe it or not, contrary to what this film may suggest, British and Commonwealth troops comprised both 65% of the naval forces as well as the land forces on D-Day, including taking these American Rangers ashore on LCAs. In my mind, historically speaking, this is one of the great shortcomings of the film, not necessarily just in regard to this scene, but in the movie as a whole, because D-Day was really this international coalition, this idea of international togetherness to defeat Nazi Germany here on the shores of France. And you see no service members from any other Allied countries in the entire movie. And they could have very much been, fixed in little moments like this. So it is what it is, though. As we see the ramps go down here, I'm reminded of so many of the first-hand accounts that I've researched and read and written about in my book, Dispatches of D-Day. And one that I thought it was particularly fitting to share with you, that I thought matched the intensity of this moment, is that of a Coast Guardsman who was shuttling GIs to shore, a guy by the name of Herman Fulton, Jr., who was from Atlanta, Georgia. And about a month after the invasion, a letter that he wrote home appeared in an Atlanta newspaper, and a portion of it had this to say: "It was a pitiful sight seeing men topple over the water before us, but still our soldiers pressed forward, fighting as they went. The sound of this concentrated ballet barrage peppering the sides of our boat and watching the 88s roll overhead was the most terrifying experience we've ever had." And indeed, this is the sort of chaos that Spielberg is trying to represent in these opening scenes, and he does so quite effectively. As we briefly get the German perspective here from the machine gun emplacements at the top of the bluff, I'm reminded of a number of things. First and foremost here, another little thing that the movie gets wrong: it can't control Mother Nature, of course, but the tide is far too high in these opening scenes. Now, in a lot of its Mediterranean operations, the United States military had landed its troops at high tide, the idea that they will have less beach to run. But because of the thick concentration of beach obstacles, and so on and so forth, it was opted for Operation Overlord, that the troops would land at low tide. And so, in contrast to a few dozen yards of beach that we see here in this so-called murder hole that Captain Miller was warning his men about, in reality it would have perhaps been several hundred yards of sand, an even more terrifying prospect for the men who actually landed on Omaha Beach on June 6th. I'm also reminded of the exploits of one of the German defenders who was manning a machine gun, an MG-42, much like we see here in these opening scenes, a German gunner by the name of Heinz Severloh, who with several 100,000 rounds of ammunition perhaps struck down many hundreds of Americans who were swarming ashore on Omaha Beach. And so the intensity here cinematically is just beyond belief, and it certainly left me awestruck the first time I saw it, as was the case for a lot of World War II veterans who saw it in theaters upon its release in 1998. The concrete bunker here that we see at the top of the bluff, there's really not a bunker that actually looks like that on Omaha Beach. What we see here is a cinematic mashup, kind of a monster mashup of different types of German fortifications. A lot of them would have been a little bit more hidden. The one here is very pronounced against the skyline. That would have been a very ripe target for the Allied air forces. But you know, the one here, I believe, is supposed to be a cinematic representation of what is known as Widerstandsnest 62, or perhaps Stand 72. And more often, a lot of these larger concrete bunkers would be facing down the beach, pointing down the length of the beach rather than across the beach. And then that way they could inflict greater triangulation of fire, and they could hardly miss any of the Americans as they were coming ashore as a result. But if you go to Omaha Beach looking for this bunker, you won't be able to find it, even if you can find it in a lot of subsequent video games that come out after this movie. Although it's not scientifically possible to be shot underwater like this, the movie does show men accurately drowning. Operation Overlord could have as very well been called Operation Overload. A lot of these men had 80, 90, 100 pounds of equipment. To make matters worse, they had not been given proper instruction on how to properly inflate their life belts. I have an example of one such life belt here. This is an actual one from the World War II years. You can see it being recreated and worn here as a costume prop in various scenes of the film. It is inflated by CO2 canisters here in the front. The problem is that men had worn these around their waist rather than under their armpits, and when they inflated them in the water, they became top heavy. They flipped over in the water, and their legs were dangling out of the top of the surf as a result. And it's in the realm of possibility that these life belts killed as many American GIs on D-Day as they saved. And so the idea of American soldiers drowning here as they're trying to work their way ashore is dreadfully accurate. To recreate the sounds of bullets hitting flesh, military advisor Dale Dye actually went out to a shooting range, and he put small microphones into large pieces of meat, and they would shoot at them and capture the sounds accordingly. And so the sound, the cacophony of battle in this film is definitely spot on in this regard. The large log beach obstacles were known as
obstruction beams.
The whole philosophy behind all of this is that there would be teller mines attached to the top of them. And the Germans anticipated if the Allies were to land in this vicinity, they would land at high tide. They wouldn't be able to see these underwater obstacles. They would hit those logs and detonate the mine. The movie has those shown in here, but most of them are in fact facing the wrong direction. They were meant to go the other way. There was the belief that the boats would go up the ramp accordingly, created by the logs. And so I believe that this was caught at the last minute. The filmmakers tried to correct some of them, but they weren't able to correct them all. One of the cutting-edge elements about Janusz Kaminski's Academy Award-winning cinematography is that it really gives us a boots-on-the-ground perspective in a way that previous war movies had not. And what Steven Spielberg did is that he gave Kaminski war correspondent Robert Capa's 11 photographs from Omaha Beach. And these are iconic photographs that shows these waterlogged, overworked soldiers desperately pushing their way ashore. And there are some shots in these opening scenes that look, replicated verbatim almost from Kappa's photos. And so you can see how those sorts of primary sources really leave a mark on this artistic recreation. As we see this carnage unfold and men being blown apart, I'm reminded of the experiences of a young Jewish soldier, a kid who was a gifted baseball player by the name of Harold Baumgarten, who was a member of the 29th Infantry Division, and he stepped on mines. Part of his jaw was blown away. The flaps of his cheek were blowing in the breeze. There was no way that he should have survived his ordeal on Omaha Beach. He later undergoes, over a dozen reconstructive surgeries, and then becomes a doctor because he wants to help people in the same way that individuals helped him. And so that's just one of many, many stories of gallantry that we can find on Omaha Beach. And a lot of people think the water turning red was a theatrical liberty taken on Spielberg's part, but there are firsthand accounts that indicate this exactly, that there were sections where the casualty concentration was so high that the water did in fact turn red. As we see an enlisted man asking Captain Miller, "What do we do now, sir?" We can see the blue and gray patch of the 29th Infantry Division on his sleeve. And indeed, in this sector, men of the 116th Infantry Regiment, which were part of that division, landed here in this spot. And so it wasn't just Captain Miller's Rangers who were landing here. The much larger contingent were infantrymen, and then further on down the beach were men of the Big Red 1, the 1st Infantry Division.
What are you guys? 104th Medical Battalion, sir! Here to set up field operations! Get rid of that crap! Grab yourselves some weapons! Follow me!
Men of the 104th Medical Battalion were in fact on Omaha Beach in some of these opening phases. The first 3 of them landed with the 116th Regiment, but they were not carrying typewriters. They were carrying litters and bandages and all of the medical equipment necessary. And they certainly did not put those items down to pick up weapons or ammunition or anything like that, because these medics were desperately needed. As an interesting side note here too, the typewriter that's being carried by this one, presumably a medical clerk, is an absurdly big one. Like, we're talking like a ledger book typewriter. This is not the sort of field typewriter that your average clerk or war correspondent would be carrying out in the field. And of course, the size, the magnitude of the typewriter is a cinematic device that's being used to illustrate the absurdity of this situation. So I suppose it works.
I'm hit low! Gas! Navy Beach Battalion, sir! I gotta clear these obstacles! Make holes for the tank!
As there are these demands to make way for the others, this was a very much a real-life imperative on the minds of officers like Captain Miller as they were swarming ashore, because whether or not you moved forward as an individual or as a squad or a company, that conveyor belt behind you still continued to move, and the subsequent waves, the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, they were still going to be coming ashore whether you moved or not. And if you did not move forward, there would be such a high population of American troops at the end of the beach that would only make things more dangerous. And so because of everything going on behind you, you had to momentarily erase from your mind everything that was happening in front of you. And that's what made this situation so scary in the minds of so many.
On All the armor is foundering in the channel! Order, sir! You go somewhere else! I'm clearing this one!
Sailors of the 7th Naval Beach Battalion, as we see here, were in fact on Omaha Beach, and clearing obstacles was only one of their obligations in this very desperate hour. They would also oversee the repair of small watercraft, the evacuation of wounded. They could sometimes act as traffic cops, much like MPs would on the beachhead. Their tasks were very, very multifaceted. And clearing beach obstacles with demolition charges would be only among a small number of them.
Navy Beach Battalion, sir! I gotta clear these obstacles! Make holes for the tanks! All the armor is foundering in the channel!
The idea of all of the armor floundering in the channel defies what is just a few feet away from Captain Miller, because as he is dragging Frank, his lieutenant, his XO, in the subsequent scene, you can actually see a Sherman tank in the background, slowly inching its way up the beach. And indeed, there were 15 Sherman tanks, duplex drive tanks, DD tanks as they were often referred to, that had these flotational devices, these flotational rings going around them, these tall exhaust vents going out the back so seawater wouldn't get into the engines. 15 of them had been aimed for this vicinity. A lot of them got stuck in the water. Some of them did sink. 3 of them, in fact, were able to make it up the beach. And so not all of the armor is floundering in the channel. And if you look closely enough in the background, you can see an Easter egg, and you can actually see one of those Sherman tanks moving upward. Things are naturally greatly condensed here from a time perspective. Here in less than 10 minutes, the Rangers are able to reach the shingle at the base of this bluff. In reality, it took the Rangers over an hour just to get that far. And there were some sectors on Omaha Beach where men were under fire for upward of 6 or 7 or 8 hours.
Cat F!
A student one time asked me what Cat F means. What that stands for is Commander Amphibious Task Force. So yet again, one of these other sort of managerial positions in the combat zone, if you will, of people who are responsible for the funneling and placement of troops who are going ashore.
Battalion Surgeon, sir!
One of the other hidden bits that are often overlooked as the medics are taking care of wounded men, you can see one of them gets hit and the bullet goes through his canteen, blood spurts out of the canteen, his own blood, and then he's there shoving a Carlisle bandage down his pants, caring for himself, as was sometimes the case with wounded men on Omaha Beach.
Not enough. It's not enough.
Dog 1 exit. That's got to be that cut on the right, or is it the one on the left?
No. Deerville is to the west. This is Dog 1.
The Dog 1 exit, also known as the Verville Draw, was one of these crucial geographic components of the means of cracking the safe, so to speak, on Omaha Beach. And you really don't get a sense of it in the film. Then, like today, the Verville Draw was a paved road leading up out of the beach here at the Dog 1 exit. Of course, having a paved road going off the beach was considered prime real estate for the American service members, who would of course need that existing infrastructure to carry troops, weapons, tanks, and everything else imaginable off the beach. You really don't see that sort of paved road or anything like that. And it only gets this very brief nod in the film. But tactically speaking, everything hinged on control of that road.
Bangalores! Bring up some Bangalores! Engineer coming! Grenades!
Bangalore torpedoes could have the potential to blow a 20-foot wide hole in an obstruction or a minefield like this. And, they were used not only to clear a path, as we see depicted here in Saving Private Ryan, but also to, clear any of those underground explosives that American soldiers might otherwise step on. It was used with a blasting cap. They were used in fairly significant number here on the beachheads. And you can also see other cinematic representations of this being used in other D-Day films, such as Darryl F. Zanuck's The Longest Day, and also Sam Fuller's The Big Red One.
Be your bayonet.
For as trite and small as this may seem, we see GI ingenuity unfolding here with Captain Miller's use of a mirror and an M1 Grand bayonet being used here in this scene. And you may be wondering, why would he even have a mirror on him, or why would somebody have a mirror? Well, this was part of your basic hygiene kit, because soldiers were required to shave every day, and even as they were in the Normandy hedgerows in the week after this, soldiers diligently shaved because it was one of the few means in which they could feel clean for a time. And as to the bubble gum, American soldiers always had bubble gum. And as one German prisoner later said, he said Americans were chewing on bubble gum as frequently as cows were chewing on grass.
Covering fire!
They probably wouldn't have silhouetted themselves against the top of the ridge in such a pronounced way. If you go to the D1 area today, you can see these small bunkers and dugouts in the sides of the cliff. You can go walk through them in some circumstances. This is very, very pronounced by contrast.
Oh my God, I'm heartily sorry for having offended thee. I detest my sin for having offended thee, O Lord. I detest my sins for having offended thee. Listen to me, Lord.
As we see the chaplain here, another question that begs to be asked is, were there in fact chaplains here in the opening moments of D-Day on the beaches? And the short answer is yes. And I was able to find one really great little account from my research of D-Day era newspapers. And one includes the exploits, this is a newspaper article, of Chaplain Julian S. Ellenberger, who was in the 4th Infantry Division, and that's the division that my grandfather was in when he went ashore on D-Day on Utah Beach. And this article says the chaplain was Julian S. Ellenberger of Greenwood, South Carolina, who went ashore on D-Day only 30 minutes after the initial assault troops. Besides administering spiritual aid to the wounded and dying, Chaplain Ellenberger assisted in establishing and maintaining a first aid station on the beaches under intense enemy fire, and despite slight wounds from shell fragments, remained at the station until it was demolished. And for doing that, Chaplain Ellenberger was awarded the Silver Star, rightfully so. With this great sort of bird's eye view shot looking down on the beach, right beside some of the coastal fortifications, you can see men wiggling their way up this very, very narrow path. And I think that this is supposed to be the Verville Draw. And so if you look at photographs and footage, and even from back then, you can see that it's a lot more substantial than shown here. To my knowledge, there were no flamethrowers used here, at least in this sector of Omaha Beach. This is a pure creative license on the part of the filmmakers, and who can blame them, because it is just stunning. It looks apocalyptic. It is literally and visually consuming in so many regards, and of course it leads to this very iconic line delivered by an embittered GI of "Don't shoot, let them burn." And I think this is a very revealing line because it's one of many bits of dialogue that we see in the movie here that I think chips away at a myth of the World War II soldier, the idea that they were always kind of, cute teenage guys, who drank milkshakes and were really innocent and religious. And well, no, combat has the ability to bring out both the good and the bad in individuals. And somebody expressing a sentiment like, "let them burn," is something that is very evocative and accurate to the moment. These three nearly back-to-back scenes showing American soldiers executing would-be enemy prisoners, I think, is likewise very revealing. The likes of which, additionally, not something typically shown in American war movies. There was this previous notion, an inaccurate one, that Americans were somehow above murdering prisoners. And Americans, they were very vengeful, whether they were amphibious troops or whether they were paratroopers. And there is ample evidence to indicate that these sorts of things happen. And they're incredibly ugly. They're uncomfortable. They should make us uncomfortable. But such was the reality of war in this all-consuming nature as it was here around the beachheads.
What? I'm sorry, I can't understand what you're saying.
The other thing to take note of here, too, is that these seemingly German men who are attempting to surrender are, in fact, not speaking German. They are Czech. And this may seem rather quizzical at first glance. But in reality, perhaps as many as 1 out of every 5 German soldiers who were manning the coastal defenses in Normandy were, in fact, conscripted troops from other countries. They included Georgians, Cossacks, Poles. There were even a few Koreans whose story requires a whole other video, who were captured by Americans. And so these units were known as Ost battalions or East battalions. They were troops captured from Eastern European or even Asian countries in some circumstances. And 3/4 of German ground forces were fighting on the Eastern Front at this time. And so a lot of the German troops who were stationed in Normandy, they were not the cream of the crop in many circumstances. The cream of the crop had been dead for 3 or 4 years by this point. But it really speaks to the diminished nature of the German military by the time we get to the spring and summer of 1944. It also speaks to the massive ideological contradiction that the Germans had to conscript slave soldiers from other nationalities and of different ethnicities to fight for their supposedly superior empire, racially speaking. And so this is a scene that speaks to a lot of things, but it ultimately just shows how ugly war is. One of the German units that was largely comprised of foreign conscripts was the 716th Infantry Division. That's one prime example that I can think of, and certainly they were not alone. The large bunker with the coastal gun that we see jutting out of it here that's being taken out by a rifle grenade is, once again, you're not going to find any bunker that actually looks like that in either the Dog Green sector or the Charlie sector of Omaha Beach. This looks a little bit more like something that you would find at the Crisbeck Battery that is located near Utah Beach. This is a large coastal gun emplacement, and in reality, it would be nowhere this close to the water's edge. Here, you know, it's a few dozen yards from the top of the bluff, but it's certainly really imposing looking, and you can hardly blame the production designers for wanting to put something big and massive like this here, because it really says, oh crap, like look at, you know, what they were looking down the barrel of here as they were working their way up the beach. The idea of Sergeant Horvath putting dirt or sand from his various campaigns in tin cans and putting them in his haversack, it's something that tourists today do, but it's not something that your average GI during the Second World War would have done. I mean, that's ultimately, it's just extra weight that you're carrying around. And if you were a soldier in the 2nd Ranger Battalion, you learned to trim as much extra weight as possible as you were going around. But thematically, it works because it shows that at least some D-Day combatants had been around before, that this war was ongoing for a while. But, you know, all that said, for the vast majority of American D-Day veterans, June 6, 1944 was in fact their first taste of combat, especially if you were a ground soldier.
That's quite a view.
Yes, it is.
And it remains quite a view to this very day. As I often encourage people, you know, watching a movie or reading a book, it pales in contrast to going and actually visiting these places. Producer Andy and I have had the opportunity to go trek the Normandy battlegrounds with friends and family. It's just such a unique and humbling experience to go to these places, check them out for yourselves. And if you're ever looking for a unique historical place to go, you certainly can't go wrong with Normandy. What we just saw are stunning and powerful scenes, especially from a cinematic standpoint. And even though they condense things and they do take some liberties, historically speaking, it's, I think, rightfully heralded as one of the best depictions of warfare brought to the big screen. If you liked this episode of Real History, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button down below. You can also click on the link that will take you to our original full-length episode that is nearly 2.5 hours long. If you love Saving Private Ryan and if you want to learn more about the historical background, that is the video for you. We also welcome you to go check out our website, realhistoryfilms.com, where you can find educational resources, including some educational content on Saving Private Ryan, if you have permission to show any portions of it in the classroom. And as always, if you really appreciate what we do, we welcome you to not only subscribe, but to check out our t-shirt store and also consider supporting us on Patreon. These are the things that allow us to keep bringing you top quality content about history and Hollywood. So, thank you once again for tuning in. We'll see you next time on Real History, and until then, stay curious.